Today, Chapter 12, Further Adventures of the Holy Club. It almost sounds like the Justice League or some group of Marvel characters. It's not. Characters, yes. Cartoon, no. Let me read. Charles mounted to the roof of the London-Oxford coach. He was relieved to see that the benches had sides, because that meant there was less danger of his being thrown off balance. He settled himself as comfortably as possible, bracing his feet against his traveling bag. Then, paying no attention to his fellow travelers, he took Samuel's gift book out of his pocket and began to read. Selin, read. He had expected and even hoped that the book would be dull. On the contrary, though, he found it as interesting as it was instructive. There were 24 chapters, all of them expanding and illustrating the opening sentence he had read aloud to Samuel. Devotion signifies a life given or devoted to God. In each chapter, Law used a different type of personality to illustrate his theme. Why, said Charles to himself, this William Law is as good at character sketches as Joseph Addison himself. I can see each of the people, the mother, the parson, the merchant, as clearly as I can see these people atop the coach with me. Thinking that, he took his first real look at the other top coach riders. He found himself wondering about them and wishing he had the time to talk to them. He scolded himself, however, for even considering such an unmethodical diversion, and gave his full attention to the book once more. With satisfaction, he noted that William Law, too, favored a rigid time schedule with every moment of every day planned for. Then it was that Charles discovered where Law's methods and Wesley's methods differed. He knew at once why Samuel had smiled and why he had agreed with Charles that Law's book was just what he and his Holy Club friends needed. The difference was all important. Whereas John emphasized that every moment ought to be directed toward helping oneself towards salvation, William Law emphasized the need for helping others achieve it. Law, in fact, believed that each day should start with a charitable act, and thus set a pattern for the hours that followed. Charles could scarcely wait to get to Oxford and to set his friends to reading the serious call. Fortunately, it was Sunday evening, and the Methodists would be meeting in John's rooms. This book would be perfect as the prescribed book of divinity to read aloud to the group. The other Methodists were just as excited by William Law's book as Charles was. It succeeded where Samuel never could have, in persuading John and Charles and their followers to give up some of their self-absorption and to start applying some of their zeal outside their own little circle. Before long, in fact, they were spending all their spare time in seeking out the needy and making the sick as comfortable as their means allowed. They urged church attendance. They even taught illiterates to read, using, as Susanna had, the Bible as their primer. The jails of the 18th century were terrible places. The jailer was the lord and master of his prison, and the fate of his captives was entirely in his hands. If the prisoner had money to pay for them, he received bedding, food, and water. If he did not, he might lie on the cold, wet floor and die of starvation for all that the jailer cared. the plight of the prisoner was beginning to get some attention in the last years of the third decade, mainly because the friend of a member of Parliament had died in Fleet Prison from hunger and neglect. The tragedy was particularly sad because the man, Castle, had been imprisoned on a false charge. The Member of Parliament, James Oglethorpe, had been out of the country and did not know of his friend's situation until too late to help him. Castle did not die in vain, though, because his death moved Oglethorpe to ask the House of Commons for an official investigation into the state of the prisons of England. A committee was formed for just such a purpose, with Oglethorpe himself as chairman. The committee discovered that a sentence to jail was indeed a sentence to death. Once the prison gates clanged behind a man, he was a forgotten soul unless someone on the outside cared enough to remember him. The findings of the committee aroused certain people to start working toward prison reform, but it was a long, uphill fight. It was, in fact, just the sort of crusade young zealots were looking for. One day, in 1730, William Morgan came to a meeting of the Holy Club, all fired with enthusiasm. "I went to the Castle prison today," he cried, "and I talked to some of the prisoners. Poor souls, they were so glad to talk to someone. I prayed with them, and they looked at me as if I were the good Lord himself. I think we Methodists should make a special point of visiting the jails." Morgan's enthusiasm quite stirred the other club members. They determined to make room for twice-weekly prison visitation in their schedules. The result was that the Methodists were more than ever the cause of consternation and amazement to their fellows at Oxford. The average undergraduate could not understand why anyone wanted to expose himself to the filth and disease-laden air of any prison. The citizens of the city of Oxford agreed with the students. Moreover, they thought the Wesleys and their followers were meddling in an area that was none of their business. At first, the objectors contented themselves with calling the Methodists mocking names. Later, though, when they saw their words had no effect, they took to throwing stones, mud, and rotten vegetables. Once, when John came out of Castle prison, he was hit squarely in the face with a tomato. He stood there with the red juice running down his face like blood and staining his black gown. He looked at his tormentors, his blue eyes clear and unwavering, and soon the crowd turned and went away. This show of bravery on Charles's part attracted certain other well-meaning young men to him. Gradually, the little band of Methodists acquired new recruits, among them a student named George Whitefield. Whitefield's background was as different as could be from the Wesleys. His mother, a widow, ran the Bell Inn at Gloucester. At the age of 5, when Charles Wesley was learning his alphabet at his mother's knee, George Whitefield was already a potboy, drawing beer and pouring gin for his mother's customers. Like Charles, though, George Whitefield loved plays and play acting. He saved every tip a customer gave him, and when he had enough money for a ticket, he'd find his way to the local theater. Like Charles, too, George had a fine singing voice and used it on every occasion. He was at Oxford in the position of a serving boy at Pembroke College, his fees paid in return for services rendered to certain rich lordlings. However, he too had read William Law's Serious Call, and had ordered his own days with a method that worked well for him. "I have longed to meet you," he told Charles, when finally he screwed up the courage to speak to the younger Wesley. "For almost a year I've watched you go about your business of mercy, wishing I were brave enough and good enough to join you." "Are we so formidable?" asked Charles. George Whitfield shook his head. "Not you, but what you stood for. I did not think I was brave enough to stand the kind of treatment that you and the others receive." "What changed your mind?" asked Charles. "When I saw the crowd turn away as if whipped by merely a glance from you, I knew I needed you," Whitfield simply said. "My soul is athirst for someone to lift up my hands when they hang down and strengthen my feeble knees. I've never known anyone who could before." Charles felt very humble when he heard George Whitfield's needs. He himself had always had someone. First there was his mother Susanna, next there was his brother Samuel, now he had John. "I will introduce you to my brother John," Charles said. "He's more experienced than I am. Why, he's almost a saint." The young Methodists' other recruits were from various colleges. John Gambold of Christ Church, John Clayton of Brasenose, Benjamin Ingham of Queen's College. They all found rigid adherence to forms and ceremonies to their liking, and they were willing to accept the Bible as an infallible guide for life. For 6 years, this little group of Methodists lived the lives of martyrs, eating too little, sleeping too little, driving themselves too hard. William Morgan, who had at first suggested the prison visitations, spent so much time in the damp dungeons that he acquired lung fever, tuberculosis. John was the victim of a chronic stomach trouble. Charles, too, was ill very often, but he forced himself to maintain as rigid a schedule as ever. Often, Charles was so sick he longed to lie down and die. Since, however, he believed that life was only a training ground for life everlasting, he felt he had to pile up credits on earth, as many as possible. In the summer of 1735, both Charles and John were summoned to Epworth. The Reverend Samuel was dying, and he wanted to see all his children once more. Charles spent a long time alone with him one afternoon. They had not been alone with each other like this for years, not since Charles had sat with the rector to learn Greek and Latin. Memory of those days lay in the eyes of father and son as they looked at each other. Quickly, because there was so much to say, Charles spoke of his years at Westminster, of his years at Oxford, and of the Holy Club. The rector listened quietly until Charles started to tell of the work the young Methodists were doing. Then the old man held up his hand to stop Charles's flow of words. "I have to tell you what your mother said when both your letters and John's became increasingly full of the work you and your friends were doing," the Reverend Samuel said. Charles felt a twinge of discomfort. "Mother does not approve?" he asked. "In principle, yes, of course," said the rector. "But she thinks there is something lacking in the way you strive self-centeredly for salvation." "What did Mother say?" Charles asked then. "I wish," she said, "that they would talk less of themselves and more of God." Charles repeated his mother's words to himself, and he felt bruised all over. They were just a variation of what Samuel had said years before: "You're leaving God out of your life." Like a little child, he clasped his father's hand. "Father," he said, "tell me what to do." The rector started to reply, but suddenly his face contorted, and he gripped Charles's hand as if it were a lifeline. He gasped, and the beads of perspiration broke out on his forehead. Charles, who had found the words to comfort prisoners condemned to die, could think of nothing to say to his father. He took a cloth and with his free hand gently wiped the rector's face. Gradually, the old man relaxed his hold, and soon he was able to smile. "Your face is as white as an altar cloth," he said to Charles. "I'm sorry I frightened you." "Oh, Father," cried Charles, overcome by the fact that at such a time his father could think of him. "I wish I had as clear a faith as you and Mother do. Why don't I? Where have I lost my way?" The rector looked at him with eyes that were serene and clear. "My faith is simple, my Charles," he said. "I believe in God." "Even when he makes you suffer so?" said Charles. "Especially then," said his father. "God chastens me with strong pain, even as his son suffered. I praise him for it. I love him for it." Charles shook his head, not understanding. The old man laid his hand on the shaking head. "Be steady, Charles, be steady. The Christian faith will revive in men's hearts. It will revive in your heart." He lay back on his pillows and closed his eyes. That evening, he died.